The Mafia boss paid my debt. Now I belong to his world. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from. And if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The scent of stale tobacco and desperate sweat clung to the walls of the basement, a cloying perfume that Jacqueline Moore had learned to associate with her brother's worst mistakes. She stood near the heavy iron door, her thrifted beige trench coat pulled tight around her frame, as if the fabric could serve as armor against the men staring at her. This place, a windowless concrete box beneath a failing laundromat in the industrial district, was not where executive assistants or school teachers belonged, yet here she was, her knuckles white as she clutched her handbag. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single flickering bulb that swung like a pendulum, her brother Leo was on his knees. His lip was split, a ribbon of fresh crimson dripping onto the dirty floor, and the sight of it made Jacqueline's stomach twist into a hard, painful knot. She did not scream, nor did she cry, because years of cleaning up Leo's disasters had eroded her hysteria down to a weary, razor-sharp resolve. Markov, the man holding the debt, sat on a folding metal chair that groaned under his immense bulk, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a serrated knife. He was a brute of a man, built like a refrigerator and smelling of cheap vodka and violence, his eyes devoid of anything resembling mercy. He looked up at Jacqueline, his gaze raking over her with a slowness that made her skin crawl, lingering on the curve of her neck and the exhaustion bruising the skin beneath her eyes. He chuckled, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to vibrate through the damp air of the basement. He told her that $80,000 was a lot of money for a boy who barely knew how to hold a deck of cards, and he doubted a girl dressed in clearance rack fashion had that kind of cash sitting in her bank account. Jacqueline stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete, the sound echoing with a surprising authority that made two of Markov's thugs shift uncomfortably near the wall. She told him she had $5,000 in cash and could set up a payment plan for the rest, her voice steady despite the terrified hammering of her heart against her ribs. Markov laughed openly then, tossing the knife from one hand to the other with practiced ease. He stood up, towering over Leo's shivering form, and kicked her brother in the ribs, eliciting a pathetic groan that tore through Jacqueline's composure. He told her that payment plans were for banks and that in his world, debts were paid in blood or flesh. He stepped over Leo and began to close the distance between himself and Jacqueline, the threat clear in his heavy, deliberate strides. Jacqueline backed up until her shoulders hit the cold metal of the door, her hand fumbling inside her bag for the pepper spray she knew would be useless against a man of this size. She braced herself for the impact, for the pain, her mind racing through the horrific possibilities of what would happen next, when the heavy iron door behind her suddenly swung open with enough force to send her stumbling sideways. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the air sucked out as if a vacuum had been engaged. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating, as a man stepped through the threshold. He did not look like he belonged in the grime of the industrial district. He looked like he had descended from Mount Olympus to inspect the insects. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders encased in a midnight blue suit that was tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin. His hair was dark, swept back from a face that was devastatingly handsome and utterly cold, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass and his eyes the color of polished steel. He did not look at Jacqueline. He did not look at Leo. He looked at the dust on his polished Oxford shoe with a distinct expression of distaste before lifting his gaze to Markov. The change in Markov was immediate and pathetic. The bulky brute who had been ready to snap Jacqueline in half suddenly looked like a scolded child, his face draining of color until it resembled raw dough. He stammered, lowering the knife, and addressed the newcomer as Mr. DeLuca. The name rippled through Jacqueline's mind, dredging up vague memories of newspaper headlines she usually skipped, articles about mergers, acquisitions, and rumors of a criminal empire that the police could never quite touch. Donovan DeLuca, the CEO of DeLuca Enterprises, and, if the rumors were true, the man who held the city's underworld in a stranglehold. Donovan stepped further into the room, 2 silent men in dark suits flanking him like shadows, their hands resting casually near the holsters beneath their jackets. Donovan spoke, his voice a low, smooth baritone that commanded attention without raising a decibel. He asked Markov why he was conducting noisy business when he had been given specific instructions to keep this sector quiet for the week. Markov began to babble excuses, pointing a shaking finger at Leo, claiming the boy owed the house and was refusing to pay. Donovan's steel-gray eyes finally slid toward Leo, analyzing the trembling young man with the disinterest one might show a dead rodent, before his gaze drifted upward and locked onto Jacqueline. The moment their eyes met, Jacqueline felt a jolt of electricity arc down her spine, a primal warning that she was in the presence of a predator far more dangerous than Markov could ever hope to be. Donovan studied her, taking in the cheap coat, the defiant tilt of her chin, and the protective way she had positioned herself between the thugs and her brother. He did not smile, but a flicker of something unreadable passed behind his cold eyes. He asked her if this mess was hers. Jacqueline swallowed the lump of fear in her throat and nodded, stating clearly that the boy was her brother, and she was negotiating his release. Donovan tilted his head slightly, as if she were an interesting puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He asked her how much the debt was. When she whispered the amount, $80,000, Donovan let out a short, dry exhale that might have been a laugh in another man. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, and for a terrifying second, Jacqueline thought he was reaching for a weapon. Instead, he withdrew a checkbook bound in black leather. He uncapped a gold fountain pen and scribbled on the paper with quick, slashing strokes, tearing the page out with a sharp rip that echoed in the silent room. He held it out between two fingers, not to Markov, but to the empty air, waiting for the thug to scramble forward and take it. Markov took the check with trembling hands, staring at the numbers as if they were holy scripture. Donovan stated calmly that the debt was cleared, including the interest, and that if Markov ever touched the boy or the woman again, he would have him skinned alive and hung from the majestic bridge that spanned the city river. Jacqueline felt her knees go weak with relief, sagging against the damp wall as Markov signaled his men to back down. She rushed to Leo, helping him up, her hands checking his face for broken bones, whispering frantic reassurances. They were halfway to the door when Donovan's voice stopped her. It wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, absolute command that froze her feet to the concrete floor. He told her to wait. Jacqueline turned slowly, her heart hammering a new, erratic rhythm. Donovan was watching her, his hands now clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. He told her that while her brother was free to go, she was not. He explained, with terrifying logic, that he had just paid $80,000 for a debt that was not his, and he was a businessman who expected a return on his investments. Jacqueline bristled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of his arrogance. She told him she would pay him back, that she would work 2 jobs, 3 if she had to, that every cent would be returned. Donovan stepped closer, invading her personal space until she could smell the scent of him, sandalwood, expensive scotch, and the metallic tang of rain. He looked down at her, his height overwhelming, and told her that he had no interest in her money. He told her that money was the easiest thing in the world for him to acquire and the most boring thing for her to offer. He needed something else. He needed discretion. He needed order. He needed someone who could look a monster in the eye and not blink, which she had just done with Markov. He offered her a deal, though the tone suggested it was not a request. She would work for him, not as a cleaner or a hidden mistress, but as his executive assistant. She would manage his calendar, his life, and the chaotic intersection of his legitimate and illegitimate worlds. She would be his shadow. The salary would be generous, enough to ensure her brother never had to gamble again, but the hours would be absolute. She would belong to the company and by extension to him until he decided the debt was settled. Jacqueline looked at Leo, who was leaning against the wall, pale and useless, and then back at the man who stood before her like a dark god offering salvation wrapped in chains. She asked him what would happen if she refused. Donovan didn't blink. He simply replied that he would cancel the check, walk out the door, and let Markov finish what he started. It wasn't a choice, and they both knew it. Jacqueline straightened her spine, smoothing the front of her worn trench coat with a dignity that seemed to amuse him. She looked him in the eye, refusing to let him see the terror clawing at her throat, and accepted the terms. She told him she would start tomorrow. Donovan shook his head, a ghost of a smirk touching the corner of his mouth. He told her she would start now. He gestured to the door, where his armored SUV waited in the alleyway, the engine purring like a large beast. He told her to get in the car. As Jacqueline guided her stumbling brother out into the cool night air, she felt the heavy weight of Donovan's gaze on her back, heavy and possessive. She had saved her brother, but as she stepped toward the sleek black vehicle, She realized with a chilling certainty that she had just sold herself to the devil, and he intended to collect every ounce of what he was owed. The drive to the DeLuca headquarters was performed in a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure. Jacqueline sat in the plush leather backseat, the interior of the car smelling of new leather and climate-controlled sterility. Leo had been dropped off at their small, crumbling apartment with a stern warning from one of Donovan's guards and a cash advance from Donovan himself to clean up his face. Now, it was just her and the man who effectively owned her. Donovan sat on the opposite side of the spacious rear cabin, typing on a tablet, the blue light illuminating the sharp planes of his face. He didn't speak to her, didn't offer her water, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. It was a power move, she realized. He was establishing the hierarchy without saying a word. She was the furniture, he was the owner of the house. They arrived at the DeLuca Tower, a monolith of glass and steel that pierced the skyline of the city, dominating the surrounding buildings. The car glided into a private underground garage that looked cleaner than most hospitals Jacqueline had visited. When the doors opened, she followed him to a private elevator that required a retinal scan to access. As they ascended, the numbers on the digital display climbing higher and higher, her ears popped. The doors slid open to reveal a penthouse office that spanned the entire top floor, offering a 300-degree view of the city lights below. It was breathtaking and terrifyingly cold. The floors were black marble, the furniture sharp and modern, everything screaming of wealth and isolation. Donovan walked to a massive mahogany desk that sat before the wall of glass, tossing his tablet onto the surface. He turned to face her, leaning against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. He studied her again, this time in the harsh light of the office, seeing every fray in her coat, every smudge of grime from the basement. He told her the rules were simple. She would be at her desk at 6 in the morning. She would leave when he left, which was rarely before midnight. She would see things she did not understand, and she would hear things that could get people killed. She was to speak of none of it. Her loyalty was to be absolute. If she betrayed him, the debt would be reinstated, and the consequences would be severe. Jacqueline nodded, fighting the urge to shiver under the air conditioning, which seemed set to a temperature suitable only for cryogenics. She asked him where her desk was. Donovan gestured to a sleek, glass workstation positioned just outside his double doors. It was positioned so that he could see her at all times if he chose to leave his doors open, but she would have no privacy. He then reached into a drawer and pulled out a black credit card, sliding it across the polished wood toward her. He told her to buy clothes. He told her that she looked like a vagrant and that no one in his employ was permitted to look like a victim. He wanted suits, tailored dresses, heels that commanded respect. He told her to burn the coat she was wearing. She reached out and took the card, the plastic cold against her fingertips. It felt heavy, loaded with implication. She asked him if this was added to her debt. Donovan looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if insulted. He told her that maintenance of his assets was his responsibility, not hers. The word asset hung in the air between them, stripping away any illusion that this was a normal employment arrangement. He dismissed her then, turning his back to look out at the city he ruled, his silhouette framed against the galaxy of artificial lights. Jacqueline stood there for a moment, staring at his broad back, realizing that the danger she had felt in the basement was nothing compared to the danger standing right here. Markov wanted to break her bones. Donovan DeLuca looked like he wanted to break her soul and rebuild it in his image. She turned and walked out of the office, her heels silent on the marble, clutching the black card like a lifeline and a shackle, knowing that her life as she knew it was over. 3 weeks into her tenure as the gatekeeper to Donovan DeLuca, Jacqueline Moore had learned that silence was the loudest sound in the world. The top floor of DeLuca Enterprises was a vacuum of sound, a sprawling expanse of glass and polished obsidian stone where footsteps were swallowed and conversations were conducted in hushed, lethal tones. She had spent the first week in a state of perpetual terror, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the monster she had met in the basement to shed his corporate skin and reveal the beast beneath. But the violence she expected did not manifest in bloodshed or shouting. Instead, it was woven into the fabric of his schedule, hidden in the margins of contracts that dismantled family-owned businesses and in the terrifying efficiency with which he erased his enemies from the boardroom. Jacqueline adjusted the collar of the silk blouse she had purchased with the black card, the fabric cool and slippery against her skin. The transformation Donovan had demanded was complete, at least superficially. The thrift store trench coat and scuffed boots were gone, replaced by a wardrobe of sharp, tailored pencil skirts, structured blazers, and heels that clicked with a predatory rhythm on the marble floors. She looked the part of the high-powered executive assistant, a woman who belonged in the stratosphere of the elite. But beneath the expensive fabric, she was still the same desperate woman who had walked into a dungeon to save her brother. The only difference was that now, her cage was made of gold and glass, and her captor wore three-piece suits that cost more than her brother's entire life debt. She sat at her desk, a sleek island of technology positioned strategically outside Donovan's double doors. It was 6:30 in the morning, the city below still waking up under a blanket of gray mist, but she had been here for an hour, organizing the chaos of Donovan's life. His calendar was a minefield of legitimate business meetings and vague, blackened-out blocks of time that she knew better than to ask about. She had learned quickly that her survival depended on anticipation. Donovan did not ask for things, he expected them to be there. Coffee, black, scorching hot, placed on the coaster at 6:45. Files for the Tokyo merger arranged by priority, not chronology. The encrypted phone charged and placed in the top drawer. The elevator chimed, a soft, melodious sound that signaled his arrival. Jacqueline's spine stiffened instinctively, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Donovan stepped out, and the air in the room seemed to compress. He was on a call, his voice low and clipped, speaking Italian with a rapidity that made it sound like a weapon. He didn't look at her as he swept past her desk, but he dropped a heavy file onto her workstation without breaking stride. It was a test. It was always a test. Jacqueline caught the file before it slid off the edge, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't need to be told what to do. She opened it, scanning the documents, a background check on a senator who was opposing a zoning permit for one of Donovan's shipping warehouses. It wasn't just a background check. It was an autopsy of the man's vices. "Good morning, Mr. DeLuca," she said to his back, her voice steady. He paused at the door to his office, ending the call with a sharp tap on his earpiece. He turned slowly, his steel-gray eyes sweeping over her. He took in the new blouse, the way her hair was pinned back in a severe, elegant chignon, and the rigid posture she maintained. For a second, the cold indifference cracked, replaced by a glimmer of possessive satisfaction. He nodded, a microscopic movement. "Coffee, Jacqueline, and get the legal team on the line. I want that senator buried in paperwork before lunch." He disappeared into his office, leaving the door slightly ajar. It was an invitation and a warning. He wanted her to hear. He wanted her to know that he was watching her just as closely as she was watching him. The day proceeded with the grinding intensity of a tectonic shift. Jacqueline sat in on 3 meetings, taking notes while Donovan dismantled a rival tech firm's CEO with a calmness that was more terrifying than rage. She watched him work, fascinated despite herself. He was brilliant. There was no denying the intellect that sharpened his cruelty. He saw angles no one else saw, exploited weaknesses before his opponents even knew they were vulnerable. But there was a duality to him that kept her on edge. When the sun began to set, painting the office in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, the corporate mask began to slip. The calls changed. The men who came to see him were no longer lawyers in pinstripes, but men with scarred knuckles and bulky jackets that concealed weapons. At 7 o'clock, the intercom on her desk buzzed. "Cancel the rest of the night, we're going out." Jacqueline blinked, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. "Sir, you have a dinner with the board of directors for the charity gala." "I said cancel it," his voice was liquid granite. "Get your coat, you're coming with me." 10 minutes later, they were in the back of the armored SUV, the city blurring past in streaks of neon. The silence in the car was intimate, heavy with the scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something sharper, like gun oil. Jacqueline sat with her hands clasped in her lap, staring out the window, acutely aware of his leg just inches from hers. He was reading a dossier, the light from the overhead reading lamp casting deep shadows over his eyes. "Where are we going?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Donovan didn't look up. "To a place where contracts aren't signed with pens. You wanted to know how the debt is paid, Jacqueline. Tonight, you see the ledger." They arrived at a nondescript building in the warehouse district, the exterior crumbling brick that looked abandoned to the untrained eye. but the security detail at the steel door nodded to Donovan with terrified reverence as they approached. Inside, the world shifted. It was an underground club, the Vault, a cavernous space of velvet booths, dim lighting, and music that thrummed deep in the chest. It smelled of expensive perfume, illicit smoke, and danger. The clientele were a mix of politicians, celebrities, and criminals, all mingling in the gray zone where money washed away morality. Donovan placed a hand on the small of her back as they navigated the crowd. The touch was searing, a brand that burned through the silk of her blouse. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a statement of ownership. He guided her through the throng, his grip firm, steering her toward a private booth in the back that was raised slightly above the rest of the room, like a throne. Men nodded as he passed, women stared with hungry eyes, but Donovan saw none of them. His focus was singular. In the booth sat 3 men. 2 were forgettable muscle, but the man in the center was distinct. He was older, with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from sandstone. This was Salvi, a capo from a rival family that DeLuca Enterprises had an uneasy truce with. Salvi grinned as they approached, his teeth yellow in the dim light. "Donovan," Salvi boomed, spreading his arms. "The Iron King descends from his tower." Donovan didn't smile. He sat down, gesturing for Jacqueline to sit beside him. She slid into the leather booth, feeling small and exposed. Salvi's eyes immediately locked onto her. They were reptilian, sliding over her face, her neck, the curve of her chest. It was the look Markov had given her in the basement, but refined by decades of unchecked power. "And who is this?" Salvi asked, licking his lips. "New Dacre, you always did have exquisite taste in distractions." Jacqueline felt a flush of shame and fear creep up her neck. She stared at the table, willing herself to be invisible. "She is my assistant," Donovan said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "She is here to take notes." Salvi laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Notes? In the vault? Come now, Donovan, we don't bring notebooks to these meetings, we bring appetites." He reached across the table, his hand heavy and ring-clad, and clamped his fingers around Jacqueline's wrist. His skin was damp, his grip bruising. "Why don't you come sit over here, sweetheart? Let the men talk business while you entertain me." The world seemed to stop. Jacqueline froze, her breath caught in her throat. She tried to pull her hand back, but Salvi held fast, his grin widening into a leer. She looked at Donovan, expecting him to be annoyed, to tell her to handle it, to maybe even trade her if the deal was good enough. That was what men like him did, wasn't it? They traded assets. But Donovan DeLuca did not trade. The change in the air was instantaneous. The temperature in the booth seemed to drop 20 degrees. Donovan didn't shout. He didn't stand up. He simply reached out, his movement a blur of speed that belied his relaxed posture, and seized Salvi's wrist, the one holding Jacqueline. With a sickening crunch that was audible even over the thumping bass of the music, he twisted. Salvi howled, a sound of pure shock and agony, releasing Jacqueline as he scrambled back, clutching his hand. His bodyguards surged forward, hands reaching for weapons inside their jackets, but Donovan's own security detail materialized from the shadows behind the booth, guns drawn and leveled at the men's heads before they could even unbutton their blazers. Donovan hadn't moved from his seat. He still looked relaxed, almost bored, but his eyes were blazing with a cold, blue fire that was terrifying to behold. He picked up his drink, took a slow sip, and set it down with a deliberate clink of glass on glass. "You misunderstand the nature of my assets, Salvi," Donovan said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. "When I acquire something, it remains mine. No one touches what is mine. Not my money, not my city, and certainly not her." Salvi was wheezing, cradling his broken wrist, sweat popping out on his forehead. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the primal fear of a man who realized he had just poked a sleeping dragon. "It was a joke, Donovan, just a joke." "I don't find it funny," Donovan replied. He turned his head slowly to look at Jacqueline. His gaze dropped to her wrist, where red marks from Salvi's fingers were already beginning to bloom against her pale skin. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He reached out, his hand large and warm, and gently took her wrist. His thumb brushed over the red marks, a touch so tender it was shocking in its contrast to the violence he had just inflicted. "Are you hurt?" he asked. He wasn't asking the room, he was asking her. Jacqueline shook her head, unable to find her voice. She was trembling, not just from the encounter with Salvi, but from the sudden, overwhelming proximity of Donovan's intensity. He was protecting her. It wasn't chivalry, it was possessiveness, dark and absolute. But in a world where everyone viewed her as prey, being owned by the apex predator felt dangerously like safety. Donovan turned back to Salvi, dropping Jacqueline's hand but keeping his body angled toward her, a physical shield. "The deal is off. Get out of my city. If I see you, or any of your men, south of the river again, I won't break your wrist. I'll break everything else." Salvi didn't argue. He scrambled out of the booth, his men dragging him away into the crowd, leaving Donovan and Jacqueline alone in the velvet shadow of the booth. The music pounded on, the rest of the club oblivious to the violence that had just occurred. "Drink," Donovan ordered, pushing a glass of water toward her. His hand was steady. Jacqueline took the glass, her own hands shaking so badly the water rippled. She took a sip, the cool liquid soothing her dry throat. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. He was just. "He touched you," Donovan cut her off, his eyes locking onto hers. "Let us be clear about the terms of your employment, Jacqueline. You belong to me. That means you are under my protection. If you are damaged, it is an insult to me. Do you understand?" "I'm not a car, Donovan," she snapped, a flash of her old defiance breaking through the fear. "I'm a person." Donovan leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, the dark lashes that framed them. "In this room, everyone is a commodity. You are the only one here who doesn't realize it yet. I just raised your value. Now, no one will dare look at you, because they know the price of touching you is their life." He stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Let's go, the air in here is stale." The ride back to the penthouse was different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was charged. Jacqueline sat in the corner of the seat, watching Donovan. He wasn't reading his dossier. He was staring out the window, his hand resting on his thigh, the knuckles slightly white. He was angry, she realized, but not at her. When they reached the tower, he didn't send her home. He rode the elevator up to the penthouse with her. The doors opened to the vast, silent apartment. Jacqueline stepped out, unsure if she was dismissed. "Ice," Donovan said, walking toward the kitchen. He returned a moment later with a cloth wrapped around ice. He walked up to her, invading her space again, and took her wrist. He held the ice against the red marks Salvi had left. The cold was a shock, but Donovan's hand holding hers was hot. "I have a brother," Jacqueline said softly, watching his face as he tended to her. "He gets in trouble, I fix it. I've spent my whole life cleaning up messes. I've never had anyone do the fixing for me." Donovan looked up, his eyes softening for the briefest of moments. "You aren't the fixer anymore, Jacqueline. You're the distraction." "Is that all I am?" she asked, the question hanging in the air, weighted with a desire she hadn't given permission to exist. Donovan dropped her wrist, stepping back as if her skin had burned him. The mask slammed back into place, the cold CEO returning. "Go home, Jacqueline, get some sleep. Tomorrow is a busy day, and wear long sleeves. I don't want anyone asking questions." He turned and walked toward the wall of glass, looking out at the city he owned, isolating himself in his tower. Jacqueline stood there for a moment, nursing her wrist, her heart pounding with a confusing mixture of gratitude and frustration. She realized then that the danger wasn't just the men with guns or the sharks in suits. The real danger was the man standing by the window, the man who treated violence like a transaction and protection like a threat. The man she was starting to want, not just to survive, but to understand. She turned and left the penthouse, the elevator descending rapidly, leaving her stomach somewhere on the top floor. As she walked out into the cool night air to hail a cab, she touched the spot on her wrist where his hand had been. It was still warm. The temptation had taken root, and she knew with a sinking feeling that paying off the debt might be the easy part. Escaping him, and the way he made her feel like the most important thing in his dark, twisted world, was going to be impossible. The rhythm of life at DeLuca Enterprises had a sedative quality, a dangerous comfort that Jacqueline was beginning to mistake for safety. 2 months had passed since the night at the vault, and in that time, the boundaries between her role as an assistant and her reality as Donovan's possession had blurred into a gray haze. She knew his coffee order, black, 2 cubes of raw sugar, better than she knew her own brother's phone number. She knew the way his jaw ticked when a shipment was delayed in Hamburg, and the specific stillness that came over him before he destroyed a competitor. She had become an extension of his will, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, moving through the glass corridors of his empire like a ghost in tailored silk. But the past was a tenacious creature, one that did not respect the high-security clearance of a skyscraper. It arrived on a Tuesday, hidden within the mundane bustle of the lunch rush. Jacqueline had descended to the lobby to retrieve a specific architectural model Donovan required for a zoning meeting. The lobby was a cavern of polished marble and echoing footsteps, filled with the low hum of corporate ambition. She was signing for the package at the concierge desk, the pen cool in her hand, when a voice from her previous life sliced through the ambient noise like a serrated blade. "Jackie, well, look at you, moving up in the world." The pen slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the marble counter. Jacqueline froze, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. She didn't need to turn around to identify the speaker. The oily, self-satisfied drawl belonged to Richard, a man she had spent 2 years trying to escape, an ex-boyfriend whose charm had rotted away to reveal a core of petty cruelty and controlling jealousy. He was the reason she had learned to hide bruises with concealer. He was the debt she had paid with her self-esteem before Leo's gambling had ever become a problem. She turned slowly, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. Richard stood there, looking out of place in his cheap, ill-fitting suit, a smirk plastered across his face. He looked older, heavier, his eyes scanning her expensive dress and the Cartier watch Donovan had given her. For punctuality, he had claimed, with a mix of lust and greed. "Richard," she said, her voice flat, "what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he said, stepping into her personal space. He smelled of stale beer and desperation. "I heard a rumor you were working for the big man now. DeLuca. People talk, Jackie, especially when little Leo starts flashing cash around the old neighborhood to pay off his tab." Jacqueline's stomach dropped. Leo. She had told him to be discreet. "Leave me alone, Richard, I'm working." "Working?" Richard scoffed, reaching out to finger the lapel of her blazer. "Is that what we're calling it? You always did think you were better than where you came from, and now look at you, wrapped in designer clothes. How much is he paying you to warm his bed, Jackie, or did you just trade one user for another?" "Don't touch me," she hissed, slapping his hand away. The security guards near the elevators were watching, but they hadn't moved yet. To them, this looked like a domestic dispute, a personal conversation. Richard's expression darkened, the smirk vanishing to reveal the menace she remembered all too well. He grabbed her arm, his grip digging into the tender flesh of her bicep. "Don't get high and mighty with me. You owe me. You walked out on the lease, stuck me with the bills. I figure with your new salary you can afford to pay me back, with interest. Let's say, 10,000, just to keep me from telling your new boss exactly what kind of trash you really are." Panic flared in her chest, white-hot and blinding. It wasn't the money. Donovan spent 10,000 on wine at dinner. It was the intrusion. It was the filth of her old life staining the pristine world she had fought to survive in. She tried to wrench her arm free, but Richard held fast, enjoying her struggle. "Let go of her." The command didn't come from a shout. It came from the elevator banks, a voice of absolute zero that cut through the lobby noise instantly. The bustling crowd seemed to part like the Red Sea as Donovan DeLuca walked toward them. He moved with a predatory grace, his presence filling the vast space, sucking the oxygen out of the room. He was flanked by his head of security, a massive man named Marcus, but Donovan didn't need backup. He was the weapon. Richard faltered, his grip on Jacqueline loosening slightly as he looked up at the approaching Titan. Donovan didn't look at Richard. He looked at Jacqueline, his eyes scanning her face, then dropping to where Richard's hand was still clutching her arm. The temperature in the lobby seemed to plunge. "Mr. DeLuca," Richard stammered, trying to summon some bravado. "Just catching up with an old friend. Private matter." Donovan stopped 3 feet away. He was perfectly still, his hands hanging loose by his sides. "There are no private matters in my lobby, and you are touching my assistant." "She owes me money," Richard spat, trying to pivot to offense. "She's nothing but a—" Donovan moved. It was faster than thought. One moment he was standing still. The next, his hand was wrapped around Richard's throat, slamming him backward into one of the marble pillars with a force that shook the ground. Richard's feet dangled inches off the floor, his face turning a mottled shade of purple as he clawed uselessly at Donovan's forearm. The lobby went deathly silent. Receptionists stopped typing. Guests froze mid-stride. Donovan leaned in close, his voice a terrifying whisper that only Jacqueline and Richard could hear. "You come into my house, you threaten my people, and you think you can demand payment." Richard gurgled, his eyes bulging. "Marcus," Donovan said calmly, never taking his eyes off the man choking in his grip. "Sir," Marcus replied, stepping forward. "Take this trash out to the alley," Donovan ordered, his tone as casual as if he were ordering a sandwich. "Explain to him the property laws of this city. If he ever comes within a 5-mile radius of Miss Moore again, I want you to ensure he never walks again. Do you understand?" "Understood, sir." Donovan released his grip, and Richard crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. Before he could recover, Marcus and another guard hauled him up by his armpits and dragged him toward the side exit, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor in a pathetic rhythm. Donovan turned to Jacqueline. The rage that had just nearly ended a man's life was gone from his face, replaced by a rigid, controlled mask, but his eyes were blazing. He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently adjust the lapel of her blazer where Richard had crumpled it. "Did he hurt you?" he asked quietly. "No," Jacqueline breathed, her voice trembling. He surprised me." "He won't surprise you again," Donovan said. "Come, we are done for the day." "But the zoning meeting." "Cancel it." He guided her to the private elevator, his hand hovering near the small of her back without touching her, a protective field of energy that kept the rest of the world at bay. They rode in silence to the penthouse, the ascent feeling less like a return to an office and more like a retreat to a fortress. When the doors opened, Donovan didn't go to his desk. He went straight to the wet bar built into the obsidian wall. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, rare, aged scotch, and carried them to the sunken living area in front of the fireplace. He set one down on the low table and gestured for her to sit. Jacqueline sank onto the plush leather sofa, her legs shaking as the adrenaline crash hit her. She watched Donovan. He took a long swallow of his drink, then set the glass down with a heavy thud. He began to undo his cufflinks, tossing them onto the table. Then he did something she had never seen him do. He loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his shirt. It was a gesture of unraveling, a crack in the armor of the perfect CEO. "I apologize," he said, turning to face the fire, his profile sharp against the dancing flames. "I should have anticipated that your past would try to claw its way back. I was negligent." "You couldn't have known," Jacqueline said, reaching for her glass. The scotch burned pleasantly on the way down, settling her nerves. "Richard, he's a part of my life I thought I buried. He represents everything I tried to get away from." "He represents weakness," Donovan corrected, turning to look at her. "He is a man who feels small, so he tries to make you smaller to feel tall. I know the type. The city is infested with them." He walked over to the sofa and sat down, not on the opposite chair, but next to her. Close. The heat radiating from him was palpable. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deepening in the firelight. "Why did you help me?" Jacqueline asked, the question slipping out into the quiet room. "In the basement. Today, you say it's about the debt, about protecting your asset, but you looked like you wanted to kill him." Donovan looked down at his hands, watching the firelight play across his knuckles. "Because I know what it is like to be cornered, to be looked at as if you are nothing but currency." He reached up and unbuttoned his shirt further, pulling the fabric aside to reveal his left shoulder and chest. Jacqueline gasped softly. Across the expanse of his muscular chest, starting from the collarbone and disappearing down his side, was a network of thick, jagged scars. They weren't surgical, they were brutal, the result of fire or shrapnel or something equally catastrophic. They were old, silver-white against his tan skin, a map of agony etched into his body. "I was not born into this suit, Jacqueline," Donovan said, his voice low and raspy. "My father was a dockworker. My mother cleaned houses for people like the ones we entertain at galas. When I was 12, the syndicate, not my family, the old regime, burned our tenement block down because my father refused to store narcotics in our apartment. I was the only one who made it to the fire escape." Jacqueline stared at the scars, her hand lifting involuntarily before stopping midair. She wanted to touch them, to trace the history of his pain, but she held back. "I spent 10 years in the system," he continued, buttoning the shirt back up, concealing the wound but not the vulnerability he had just exposed. I learned that in this world, there are only two types of people, the butchers and the cattle. I decided I would never be cattle again. I built this empire not for greed, but for control, so that no one could ever burn my house down again. He turned his gaze to her, and the intensity of it pinned her to the sofa. When I saw you in that basement, standing between that animal and your brother, you were terrified. You were shaking, but you didn't move. You stood your ground against a monster because you loved something more than you feared him. He leaned in closer, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, a touch that was rough with calluses but infinitely gentle. I didn't buy your debt to own you, Jacqueline, he whispered, the truth hanging heavy in the air between them. I bought it because I recognized you. You are a survivor, and I could not watch the world eat you alive. Jacqueline's breath hitched. For months, she had viewed him as another Markov, just with better suits, a man who dealt in leverage and control. But now, seeing the scars, hearing the history, the pieces shifted. He wasn't keeping her prisoner. He was keeping her behind the walls of the fortress because he knew what roamed outside in the dark. Donovan, she whispered, saying his name without the title for the first time. It felt intimate, forbidden. I have enemies, Jacqueline, he said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Real enemies, men who make Richard look like a choir boy. The Volkov syndicate is moving in from the east. They are probing for weaknesses. Today, in the lobby, I lost control. I made a scene. That is dangerous. It shows them that I care. Do you? She asked, her heart hammering against her ribs, terrified of the answer and desperate for it. Care. Donovan stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching until it was almost painful. He looked at her lips, then back up to her eyes, a war waging behind his steel gaze. Too much, he admitted, the words sounding like a confession of sin. I care too much, and that makes you a target. He pulled his hand away abruptly, standing up and walking back to the window, putting distance between them. The moment of vulnerability slammed shut, the iron gates closing again. But the air in the room had changed. The dynamic had shifted. She was no longer just the assistant working off a debt. She was the woman who had seen the king's scars, and he was the man who had admitted that she was his weakness. Go to the guest suite, he said, his back to her. It's too late to send you home. It's not safe tonight. Stay here. Jacqueline stood up, her legs steady now. She looked at his broad back, seeing the tension in his shoulders, the weight of the empire he carried alone. She wanted to go to him, to offer the same comfort he had offered her, but she knew the timing wasn't right. He had opened the door a crack. She couldn't kick it down. Good night, Donovan, she said softly. He didn't answer, but as she walked toward the hallway leading to the guest quarters, she saw his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He was watching her reflection, his eyes burning with a dark, possessive hunger that promised that while he might be trying to protect her from his enemies, he was losing the battle to protect her from himself. That night, Jacqueline lay in the silk sheets of the guest bed, listening to the wind howl around the skyscrapers. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she was no longer afraid of Donovan DeLuca. She was afraid for him. And more dangerous than that, she was falling in love with the monster who had saved her, knowing full well that loving him meant walking willingly into the line of fire. The morning sun that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse was pale and watery, casting long, fractured shadows across the black marble floors. Jacqueline woke not to the sound of an alarm, but to the silence of the empty space beside her. The guest suite, a luxurious cage of silk and high-thread count cotton, felt too large, too cold. She rose, pulling the silk robe tightly around her body, the memory of the previous night's confession hanging in the air like heavy smoke. Donovan had shown her his scars, the physical map of his trauma, and in doing so, he had handed her a loaded weapon. He had admitted she was his weakness. In his world, that was not a compliment, it was a liability. She found him in the main living area, standing before the panoramic window that overlooked the city. He was already dressed, but not in his usual boardroom armor. Today, he wore a charcoal tactical shirt that clung to his broad shoulders and dark trousers that allowed for movement. A shoulder holster lay on the coffee table next to a steaming cup of espresso and a sleek, disassembled handgun that he was cleaning with methodical precision. The sight should have terrified her, the weapon, the grim set of his jaw, the predatory stillness of him, but instead, she felt a strange, magnetic pull. This was the reality of the man she had agreed to serve. The CEO was the mask, the soldier cleaning his gun was the truth. Donovan didn't turn when she entered, but his posture shifted, a subtle acknowledgement of her presence. He slid the slide of the pistol back into place with a sharp metallic clack, a sound that echoed in the quiet room. He told her, without preamble, that she was not going into the office today. He had arranged for a security team to transport her and her brother to a safe house in the countryside, a fortress disguised as a vineyard where the Volkov syndicate could not reach them. He spoke with the finality of a judge delivering a sentence, his voice devoid of the vulnerability he had shown by the firelight. He was closing the gates, pushing her out to keep her safe, trying to erase the target he had painted on her back. Jacqueline walked further into the room, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. She stopped a few feet away from him, ignoring the gun on the table. She told him no. The word hung in the air, small but absolute. Donovan turned then, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. He was a man used to immediate obedience, a man whose whispers commanded armies of lawyers and soldiers alike. He asked her if she understood the situation, his voice rising slightly. He explained that the Volkovs were not sending lawyers with cease and desist letters. They were sending cleaners with silencers. He told her that her debt was suspended, that she was free to go because he could not focus on the war if he was constantly looking over his shoulder to ensure she was still breathing. She stepped closer, invading the invisible barrier he always kept around himself. She told him that she hadn't stayed last night because of the debt. She hadn't listened to his history because she was his employee. She told him that if he sent her away now, he was proving Richard right, that she was just a weakness to be managed, a liability to be hidden away. She reached out, her hand hovering over his arm, and told him that she was part of this now. She had walked into the basement to save her brother, and she would not run away when the man who saved them both was under siege. She demanded to stay, not as a distraction, but as a witness. She wanted to see the world he lived in, the whole truth, before she decided if she could survive in it. Donovan stared at her, his steel-gray eyes searching her face for any sign of hesitation. He saw none. He saw only the same fierce resolve that had faced down Markov. A muscle in his jaw feathered. He reached out, his hand gripping the back of her neck, his thumb pressing into the pulse point at her throat. He told her that she was a fool. He told her that staying meant she would see blood, that she would be hunted, that the safety of the glass tower was an illusion that was about to shatter. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers, and whispered that if she stayed, there was no going back. If she stayed, she belonged to the war as much as she belonged to him. "I'm not leaving," she breathed, the promise sealing her fate. The decision was tested 3 hours later. They were in the convoy, a line of 3 black armored SUVs cutting through the mid-morning traffic of the financial district. The city was gray, a persistent drizzle slicking the streets with an oily sheen. Jacqueline sat beside Donovan in the rear of the middle vehicle, her hand resting on the leather seat, inches from his. The air in the car was thick with tension. Donovan was on the radio, speaking in rapid-fire Italian to his head of security, Marcus, who was driving. They were heading to a neutral ground, meeting with a mediator. A desperate attempt to stall the Volkov advance before the streets turned into a war zone. The attack didn't come with an explosion. It came with the screech of tires and the sickening crunch of metal on metal. A heavy sanitation truck, appearing out of an alleyway like a monolithic battering ram, slammed into the lead SUV, crumpling the armored vehicle like a tin can. The convoy screeched to a halt, chaos erupting instantly. Donovan moved before Jacqueline's brain could even process the impact. His hand was on her head, shoving her down toward the floorboard, his body curling over hers as a shield. "Stay down," he roared, the command tearing through the sudden silence of the cabin. Then the gunfire started. It sounded like hail hitting a tin roof, a rhythmic thwack-thwack-thwack against the reinforced glass of their vehicle. Jacqueline curled into a ball, her face pressed against the carpeted floor, the smell of dust and adrenaline filling her nose. Above her, Donovan was a flurry of motion. He had drawn his weapon, shouting orders into his comms. She felt the car rock as bullets impacted the heavy door panels. She heard Marcus shouting that they were pinned, that there were shooters on the rooftops. The glass window beside Donovan's head spiderwebbed, a white starburst of impact that didn't penetrate, but signaled that the armor was failing. "Marcus, get us out of here. Reverse, Reverse, Donovan barked, firing 2 shots through the specialized gun port in the door. The SUV lurched backward, tires spinning on the wet asphalt, the engine screaming in protest. Metal groaned as they scraped against the concrete divider. Jacqueline squeezed her eyes shut, her hands clutching Donovan's leg, anchoring herself to him. She didn't scream. She wouldn't scream. She focused on his breathing, ragged but controlled, the solid weight of him above her, protecting her from the hail of lead. The car spun 180 degrees, the G-force throwing them against the door, before Marcus found a gap in the traffic and gunned the engine. They tore away from the ambush, leaving the burning wreckage of the lead car behind, speeding through the rain-slick streets like a bullet leaving the chamber. They didn't go to the office. They went to a safe house, not the vineyard in the country, but a fortified brownstone in the old historic district, a building that looked innocuous from the outside but was built like a bunker on the inside. When the car stopped in the secure garage, Donovan practically dragged Jacqueline out. He didn't speak. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes dark with the violence he had just suppressed. He swept her through the steel doors, past the armed guards, and into the dim, quiet sanctuary of the main hall. He didn't stop until they were in the master suite upstairs. He kicked the door shut and spun around, packing the room like a caged tiger. He checked her over, his hands rough and frantic, patting down her arms, her shoulders, checking for blood, for glass, for any sign that his failure to predict the ambush had cost her. "I told you," he snarled, his voice breaking with the intensity of the adrenaline crash. "I told you it wasn't safe. They hit the lead car. They thought I was in the lead car, if we had been 10 seconds faster." He stopped, running a hand through his hair, disrupting the perfect style. He looked wild, dangerous, and terrified. Jacqueline stood before him, her legs shaking, but her mind strangely clear. The ambush had stripped away the last layers of pretense. Death had knocked on the window, and they were still here. "But we weren't," she said, her voice steady. "We're here, you got us out." Donovan looked at her, his chest heaving. "This time? What about next time? What about when they come for your brother? What about when they realize the best way to kill me isn't a bullet, but taking you?" He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, gripping her shoulders. "You have to go. I'll put you on a plane tonight. Switzerland, I have accounts there. You'll never have to work again. Just go, Jacqueline." "No," she said, grabbing the lapels of his tactical shirt, pulling him down to her level. "I'm not going to Switzerland. I'm not leaving you to die in this city alone." "Why?" he demanded, shaking her slightly. "Why would you stay? I am a monster, Jacqueline. You saw it today. I draw fire, I bring death." "Because you're mine," she said, the words tearing out of her throat, raw and honest. "Because you paid my debt, and now I'm paying mine. I love you, Donovan. God help me, I love you." The confession hit him like a physical blow. Donovan froze, his eyes widening, the gray swirling with a storm of emotions, shock, denial, and then a crushing, overwhelming hunger. He let out a low, guttural sound, half groan, half growl, and crashed his mouth down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was the release of months of repressed desire, fear, and the frantic need to prove that they were both still alive. He kissed her with a possessive desperation, devouring her, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her head back to deepen the contact. Jacqueline met him with equal force, her hands clutching at his shirt, her body pressing against the hard wall of his chest. The fear of the ambush transmuted into passion, hot and consuming. He lifted her up, wrapping her legs around his waist, and carried her to the massive bed, never breaking the kiss. The tactical shirt was torn open, buttons flying across the room. Her silk blouse followed. There was no finesse, only the raw, primal need to be skin to skin, to erase the scent of cordite and reign with the scent of each other. When he finally claimed her, it was a declaration. He moved over her, his eyes locked on hers, intense and burning. He wasn't just making love to her, he was branding her. He was weaving her into the very fabric of his soul, making it impossible for them to ever be separated again. "You are mine," he whispered against her skin, the words a vow and a curse. "I will burn this city to ash before I let them touch you. I promise you, Jacqueline, I will reshape this world so that you can walk in it without fear. But you are mine." "I'm yours," she whispered back, arching into him, accepting the promise and the heavy weight that came with it. They lay together in the aftermath, the room darkening as the afternoon faded into evening. The silence was heavy, but it was no longer tense. It was the silence of two people who had weathered the storm and found the eye. Jacqueline lay with her head on his chest, tracing the scars she had seen the night before. Donovan's arm was draped over her, holding her close, his breathing steady and deep. But the world outside, the brownstone, did not care about their peace. The phone on the bedside table buzzed. It was a harsh, jarring sound that shattered the intimacy of the moment. Donovan stiffened instantly, the lover vanishing and the king returning. He reached out and grabbed the phone, seeing the caller ID. It wasn't Marcus. It was an unknown number. He answered it, putting it on speaker, his hand tightening on Jacqueline's shoulder. "DeLuca," he said, his voice ice. "Donovan," a voice purred from the other end. It was accented, smooth, and terrifyingly calm. "Victor Volkov. I hear you had a bit of a traffic accident today. Terrible shame about your driver in the lead car. Good man, or just expensive?" Jacqueline felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. She sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest, watching Donovan's face turn into a mask of stone. "You missed, Victor," Donovan said, "and now you have my attention." "Oh, I've always had your attention," Volkov laughed softly. "But now I think I have something more interesting. You see, while you were playing bumper cars, my associates paid a visit to a charming little apartment in the East End. Your little bird, Jacqueline, is it? Her brother, Leo, he's quite the talker." Jacqueline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Donovan's grip on her shoulder became painful, but he didn't look at her. He stared at the wall, his eyes black holes of rage. "If you touch him," Donovan began, his voice dropping to a subsonic growl. "Touch him, we have him," Volkov interrupted, the amusement gone from his voice. "He is currently a guest of mine at the docks. Warehouse 4, you know the one. It's where you killed my cousin 3 years ago. Poetic, don't you think?" "What do you want?" Donovan asked. "I want the port," Volkov said. "All of it. The shipping lanes, the unions, the distribution rights. You sign it over to me tonight and the boy walks. You refuse? Well, I hear he has a gambling problem. Maybe we help him lose a few fingers so he can't hold the cards anymore. And after him, we come for the girl. I wonder if she is as pretty as the pictures." "You have until midnight," Volkov added. "Come alone, or the boy dies screaming." The line went dead. Silence, absolute and terrifying, filled the room. Jacqueline was trembling, tears spilling from her eyes, but she didn't make a sound. Leo. They had Leo. It was her fault. If she hadn't tied herself to Donovan, Leo would just be a degenerate gambler, not a pawn in a mafia war. Donovan slowly lowered the phone. He turned to look at her. The softness was gone. The man who had made love to her minutes ago was buried beneath the weight of the crown. He stood up, naked and unashamed, and began to dress. He pulled on fresh trousers, a fresh shirt, and then reached for the holster. He strapped the gun to his chest, checking the magazine with a mechanical efficiency that made her heart ache. "Donovan," she whispered, her voice cracking, "what are you going to do?" He walked over to the bed, leaning down to cup her face in his hands. His expression was grim, terrified, and fiercely loving. "The price," he said softly. "I told you there is always a price. They think they can use your love to break me. They think that because I love you, I will hesitate." He kissed her forehead, a lingering, desperate touch. "I am going to get your brother back," he promised. "And then I am going to end this. Tonight, the debt is paid in full. Stay here, lock the door, do not open it for anyone but me." He turned and walked out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Jacqueline sat alone in the darkening room, the promise of his love ringing in her ears, terrified that the price of their future would be his life. The reckoning had arrived, and the king was marching to war. The docks were a graveyard of rust and rotting wood, shrouded in a relentless, freezing rain that turned the world into a blur of charcoal and gray. Warehouse 4 stood at the end of a long, potholed pier, a hulking skeleton of corrugated iron that groaned in the wind. It was a place where the city's sins came to be buried, and tonight, Donovan DeLuca intended to fill a few more graves. He stepped out of his car at the security gate alone. He wore a long black wool coat over his suit, his hands empty and raised slightly to show he held no weapon. The rain plastered his dark hair to his skull, water dripping down the sharp planes of his face, but he did not blink. He looked like a statue carved from midnight, radiating a cold, terrifying stillness. The two guards at the gate, men with Volkov tattoos on their necks and submachine guns in their hands, patted him down with rough efficiency. They found the 9 tucked into his waistband and confiscated it with sneers of triumph. They didn't find the ceramic knife taped to his ankle, nor did they notice the tiny earpiece deep in his left canal. "He's waiting," one of the guards spat, shoving Donovan forward. Donovan walked the length of the warehouse floor. The space was cavernous, lit by floodlights that cast harsh, blinding beams through the gloom. In the center of the room, seated on a wooden crate, was Viktor Volkov. He was a man of excess, too much cologne, too much gold jewelry, too much cruelty. Behind him, suspended from a chain hoist by his wrists, was Leo. Jacqueline's brother looked bad. His face was a swollen mask of bruises, his shirt torn and stained with blood, his feet dangling inches off the concrete. But he was breathing. "The Iron King," Volkov boomed, his voice echoing off the metal walls. He held a glass of vodka in one hand and Donovan's confiscated gun in the other. "And here I thought you were a myth, but look at you, walking into the lion's den without a pride." Donovan stopped 10 paces away. He didn't look at Volkov, he looked at Leo. The boy's eyes fluttered open, panic seizing him as he recognized Donovan. "Donovan," Leo rasped, his voice a broken croak. "Run." Donovan's gaze shifted to Volkov. "Let him down." Volkov laughed, a wet, hacking sound. "Business first, Donovan, always business. Do you have the transfer papers for the port?" Donovan reached into the inner pocket of his coat. The dozen guards surrounding them raised their rifles instantly, the sound of safety catches clicking off filling the silence. Donovan moved slowly, deliberately, withdrawing a thick envelope. He tossed it onto the damp concrete between them. "It's all there," Donovan said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Ownership deeds, union contacts, shipping manifests. You win, Victor, now cut him down." Volkov grinned, his eyes gleaming with greed. He signaled to one of his men, who scuttled forward to retrieve the envelope. Volkov tore it open, scanning the documents with hungry eyes. "You see," he said to the room at large, "they say DeLuca is untouchable, but every man has a heart, and every heart can be stabbed. You traded an empire for a junkie gambler and a pretty girl." "I traded a liability for a clear conscience," Donovan corrected softly. "Is the transaction complete?" "Almost," Volkov said, dropping the papers. He raised Donovan's gun, aiming it not at Donovan but at Leo's chest. "But you see, I can't leave loose ends. The boy has seen my face. And you? Well, you're too dangerous to leave alive, even without your port." Donovan didn't flinch. He didn't scream. He simply sighed, the breath misting in the cold air. "I told you, Victor, you mistook my hesitation for weakness. I didn't come here to negotiate. I came here to ensure the blast radius was contained." "Blast radius," Volkov frowned, confusion flickering in his eyes. Donovan tapped his earpiece. "Now." The world exploded. It wasn't a bomb. It was a synchronized breach. The skylights high above shattered inward as 4 black-clad figures rappelled down on lines, their MP5s silenced but lethal. Simultaneously, the heavy cargo doors at the rear of the warehouse were blown off their hinges with a concussive thump as an armored truck, Donovan's backup team, led by Marcus, rammed through. Chaos erupted. Volkov's men, distracted by the sudden assault from above and behind, scrambled for cover. Donovan moved. He didn't run for cover, he ran for Volkov. Victor turned, firing a wild shot that grazed Donovan's arm, shredding the wool of his coat. Donovan didn't break stride. He closed the distance in 2 seconds, a blur of violence. He kicked Volkov's knee, shattering the joint with a sickening crunch. As the Russians screamed and buckled, Donovan grabbed the wrist holding the gun, twisting it until the weapon clattered to the floor. Donovan didn't go for the gun. He grabbed Volkov by the throat, driving him backward into the wooden crate he had been sitting on. The impact splintered the wood. Around them, the firefight raged, short, controlled bursts of gunfire as Donovan's elite security team dismantled Volkov's thugs with surgical precision. But Donovan saw none of it. His world had narrowed to the man beneath him. "You threatened her," Donovan snarled, his voice a low, demonic rumble that terrified Volkov more than the gunfire. "You said you would make her scream." "It was business," Volkov gasped, clawing at Donovan's leather-gloved hand, crushing his windpipe. "Just business." No, Donovan said, reaching down to his ankle and drawing the ceramic knife. She is not business, she is my life, and you tried to take her. He didn't make it quick, he made it personal. He drove the knife down, ending the threat of the Volkov syndicate permanently. By the time Donovan stood up, straightening his coat, the warehouse was silent. The gunfire had ceased. The smell of cordite and copper hung heavy in the air. Marcus approached, stepping over bodies with professional indifference. "Secure, sir. The perimeter is clear." Donovan nodded, his breathing heavy but controlled. He walked over to where Leo was hanging. He took the knife and slashed the ropes. Leo collapsed into his arms, sobbing with relief and pain. Donovan held the boy up, not with affection, but with a firm grip. "Can you walk?" Donovan asked. I think so," Leo stammered. "You killed him, you killed all of them." "I cleaned up the mess," Donovan said, his voice hard. "Listen to me, Leo, this is your second chance. There will not be a third. You are going to a clinic in Zurich. You will get clean, you will learn a trade. If I ever see you at a card table again, I won't send money, I'll send Marcus." Leo nodded frantically, terrified and grateful. "I promise, thank you, thank you." Donovan handed Leo to two of his guards. "Get him to the medic, then get him on the jet." He turned away, walking out of the warehouse into the rain. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands steady despite the violence he had just inflicted. He dialed the one number that mattered. It rang once. "Donovan," her voice was breathless, terrified. "It's done," he said, leaning against the side of the armored truck, letting the rain wash the blood from his hands. "He's safe. Volkov is gone." "Are you," she choked on a sob, "are you okay?" Donovan looked back at the warehouse, the tomb of his enemies. He felt a strange lightness in his chest, a weight lifted that he hadn't realized he was carrying. "I am coming home, Jacqueline, I am coming home to you." 6 months later. The city skyline was the same, a glittering, jagged line of ambition and light, but the view from the penthouse felt different. It was warmer. The stark, museum-like quality of Donovan DeLuca's home had been softened. There were fresh flowers on the obsidian console table. There was a cashmere throw draped over the leather sofa. There was life. Jacqueline stood on the balcony, the wind whipping her silk dress around her legs. She held a glass of wine, looking out at the lights, but she no longer felt small beneath them. She felt like she belonged. The glass door slid open behind her. She didn't turn. She smiled, recognizing the cadence of his footsteps. Donovan wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his chest. He felt solid, warm, an anchor in a chaotic world. "You're thinking too loud," he murmured into her hair, kissing the sensitive spot behind her ear. "I was thinking about Leo," she admitted, leaning into him. "He sent a letter. He's finished the program. He's starting an apprenticeship with a watchmaker in Geneva." "Good," Donovan said. "Precision requires patience. It will be good for him." "You saved him, Donovan," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "You saved us both." Donovan looked down at her, his face relaxed in a way the world never saw. The coldness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a fierce, steady devotion. "You saved me, Jacqueline, before you this." He gestured to the city, to the empire he had built. "This was just a fortress. I was just waiting for the siege. You made it a home." He had kept his promise. The weeks following the warehouse had been a whirlwind of restructuring. With Volkov gone, Donovan had consolidated power, but he had changed the nature of the game. He had sold off the illicit shipping lanes, moving DeLuca enterprises almost entirely into legitimate logistics and tech. He still held power, terrifying, absolute power, but he wielded it differently. He was no longer a warlord fighting in the trenches. He was a king ruling from a throne that no one dared to challenge. The violence had been pushed to the fringes, managed by Marcus, kept far away from the glass tower where Jacqueline lived. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Jacqueline's breath hitched. "I told you once that debts are paid in blood or flesh," Donovan said softly, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "But I was wrong. The only currency that matters is loyalty and love." He opened the box. Inside sat a diamond that rivaled the city lights, dark and flawless, set in platinum. "I don't want you to work for me anymore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want you to rule with me, Be my wife, Jacqueline. Be the only thing in this world I answer to." Tears pricked her eyes, hot and happy. She looked at the man who had terrified her in a basement, the man who had bought her freedom, the man who had burned down the world to keep her safe. She saw the scars beneath the suit, and she loved every one of them. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, Donovan." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He kissed her then, a deep, slow kiss that tasted of wine and forever. High above the city, in the shadow of the empire they now shared, the king and his queen stood together. The darkness was still there, lurking in the streets below, but up here, in the light they had built together, there was no fear. There was only the promise of a future that belonged entirely to them.